have been living through it for many years now. And now, the Kiev regime is intending to hold, as they have called it, taking stock of the relics of the saints which are resting in the Laura. And I did not misspeak, I did not invent it. This is a direct quote. The rampant Russophobia in Kiev is ignoring the simple fact this is not a museum exhibit. These are relics of saint fathers. Among those are Nasser the Chronicler, Ilya Muromets, and other outstanding righteous people who have been sent prayers to around the Orthodox world. Well, what a case. I'd just like to remind you, well, I think we've heard pretty much everything from President Zelensky. First, that he does not understand the people who are trying to re-educate those who are speaking Russian to speak Ukrainian. Later, we heard him mocking the Kiev authorities and Kiev regime when he was not a president, how he promised to be a president of peace, how he stood on his knees in front of the people of Ukraine just to be elected. Later, we heard a lot of interesting things about his vision about further development of civil society and democracy in his country when he was elected. Later, terrible things started. He did not just renege on his words, but he made a U-turn. I'm simply interested about this fact, the hate which has now bloomed in him, including the hate towards the monks of the Kiev Pechersk Laura. Why is it? Is he just simply mentally unhealthy, or he's very dependent and he's being fed this hatred, or simply because he does not understand and cannot comprehend what is faith and its embodiment in case of religion? Zelensky is deaf to the calls of brethren and priests to stop the impunity and to let them serve God in the Laura. What is the goal? There should be one, right? It's very cynical and very simple. It's pathetic. The comprehensive support of the Kiev's regime to the political project promoted by the Constantinople Patriarchate and the U.S. called the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Do you remember Victoria Nuland with a candle in 2013 and 14? What do you think? Is it because she really loves God? Is she worshiping? No, not at all. This is just a meme that had to be put in the minds of everyone who saw that the U.S. comprehensively support the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Zelensky stood with the same kind of candle, well, not known of what kind of religion he professes and what's his religious background, because everything that he has proposed as his values has been completely disregarded by himself. Such people were called godless people, the people without faith, that they will not spare their own mother if needed. That's what I've seen from Zelensky and his closest circle. We've paid attention to the fact that the attack on Laura and greater persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church happened just mere days after the visit by President Biden, and that happened on the 20th of February by the schismatics who have captured the St. Michael's Golden Dome Monastery in Kiev. We resolutely condemn such actions which blatantly violate rights and discriminate against millions of Orthodox Christians by calling upon dedicated international organizations to apply the necessary pressure on the Ukrainian authorities to put an end to persecution and impunity towards the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Zelensky and his regime, through deed and word, have proven that there is nothing holy to them. They are simply an instrument in the hands of the West who, to please their champions are selling off Ukraine and treat Ukrainian citizens as expendable. They destroying history and memory and using to avarice holy sites and taking stock of relics. Also, I wanted to say that when Zelensky gave out his promises and when he started to announce his new policy, well, think back. He was very active about decommunization. He was demolishing monuments to the Red Army warriors from the World War II. He was renaming streets, calling them after the names of collaborators. He abandoned our common holidays and festivals, which are truly precious to the citizens of Ukraine, of different nationalities. And all of that he did as part of decommunization. Remember them trying to scratch off the coat of arms of the Soviet Union or cover over everything that had to do with the symbols of that time. But it did not happen because people did not accept those actions. They could not comprehend them. But most amazingly, that Zelensky himself has turned into those who he fought against. So this taking stock of saints' relics that they have outlined right now is what communists did. Those who started a whole crusade against. Remember how the graves were sacrileged after the October Revolution. Remember all that sacrilege when the relics were followed around the country, and this is just simply the remains of a regular person. But this is what Zelensky is doing right now as part of decommunization. Yes, I understand that it's hard to do, but still, it is time to stop. There is time to wake up. There is time to keep at least a quantum of something human. I don't think it is reasonable to remind of everything that we always do about the goals and ends of the special military operation. The leadership of our country continues to say these words. But I wanted to talk about the 9 years since the referendum in Crimea. I spoke already about that. 9 years ago, on the 16th of March 2014, the citizens of Crimea have made their conscious choice about their future. Reunification based on the free expression of the will of the Crimeans became the implementation of the right of peoples to self-identification. We have to continue to mention it. It is in the UN Charter, the UN Declaration on the Principles of International Law, a number of covenants on human rights. Socioeconomic development of Peninsula, when part of Ukraine in 1992-2013, was not systemic and largely dependent on domestic political climate in Ukraine. The general situation was marked by a number of negative trends in economy, interethnic relations, cultural stagnation, deteriorating environmental situation. Over the past years, it was possible to overcome and solve many issues accumulated on the peninsula throughout the time in Ukraine. Tremendous amount of work was done to increase attractiveness of Crimea in economy, investments, culture, and tourism. It was based on federal target program of socioeconomic development of Crimea and Sebastopol till 2025. 9 years ago, investments over. Remember that we were responding to the energy blockade of Crimea, and remember all those subversive actions. In response to that, there was a swift installation of power grid, and very timely. Now energy security matter has been solved. Balaclava, Taurus, TPPs, as well as SOC's combined heat and power plant has been put in operation. Since 2014, there is large-scale building of gas mains, and basically every month a new settlement is connected to the gas grid. The medium level of gasification in Crimea stands at 76%, and the planned level is 83%. After Kiev cut off the North Crimean channel, The water security was an acute matter. It was not yet solved, but with the beginning of a special military operation in Ukraine, the water blockade has been lifted. The dam, installed by Ukraine in 2014, and just think of it, to cut off the water supply to Crimea. It was eliminated in February 2022. Just think about it. Those who were called their citizens by the Kiev regime, who they allegedly cared about. And as we now are learning, they were arming themselves against those citizens, and they had their water supply cut off. So they would know what would happen to them, how they would be liberated by the presidential office. Now we see it all. We need no additional proof of what they were preparing for. But this is just a side note to those who are pretending there were no issues whatsoever and it's all far-fetched and it was all peace and concord. But no, the water was cut off to the citizens of Crimea. I'd repeat it for those who don't remember it. Power supply was being mined so that Crimean citizens will be completely cut off from the power grid. I don't think I need to remind you about the Crimean Bridge. They were saying that this is all just 3D models and does not exist, and this is just Mosfilm cinema production. Later, they conducted terrorist attacks against this civilian infrastructure. And in February 2022, this dam installed by Ukraine was dismantled, and now Dnieper water is now freely flowing onto peninsula, and that helped increase irrigated land area significantly. And for the first time since 2014, Crimea saw a rebirth of a number of plant production that were, for some practical reasons, were impossible. For example, rice production. Since 2015, industrial output in Crimea has increased almost twofold and Sebastopol 2.5 times. The increase in industrial production continues. Many enterprises have been upgraded. A symbol of reunification of Crimea with Russia has become the Crimean Bridge, built in record time. Opening of highway connection using this bridge in 2018 saw an increase of inflow of cars, and that had a positive impact on socioeconomic development of peninsula. Right now, the whole peninsula from east to west is connected by a new modern highway, Taurus. I think you have to understand how painful it was for the Kiev regime. It was all a challenge for them. That's how they perceived it. That this is Russia developing its regions for the benefit of the people, for the benefit of the people who live there and will continue to do so. And on the other side, on the side of the Kiev regime, it was perceived in helpless anger. For some reason, it was perceived as a challenge. No one was going to compete with anyone. It was not a competition. We're just showing the building of civilian infrastructure, of industry, economy, financial sphere, because all of that was turned into fakes in Western media. But we did not intend to hold a competition. We've wished to the Ukraine in its borders after 2014 to overcome all of the crises that it comes against. But for them, for the people at the decision-making centers, whether independent or not, it seemed to them some kind of a tremendous domestic challenge. Well, they did not hide their desire to destroy all of these results. Remember how many times they threatened to destroy it all, that nothing will be left behind. There are cultural projects. There is a large-scale restoration of most important historical sites. Vorontsovsky, Livadia and Miskorsky palaces and parks, as well as Eastern Crimea and Bakhchisarai Historical Cultural Reserve. There is reconstruction of rural cultural centers, art schools, out-of-class activities centers for kids and youth. Crimeans are now receiving social aid and health care by Russian standards. There is support for motherhood and childhood in 2022. 6 schools and 118 preschool facilities have been built. 15 are in the pipeline. The state is guaranteeing all respect of all human rights under international obligations since it's a standard. A major achievement in interethnic relations was the decree by the President of the 12th of September 2015 on the measures to rehabilitate Armenian, Bulgarian, Greek, Italian, Crimean Tatar, and German communities and state support for their revival and development. This document has a number of measures for social development of Crimean peoples and ethnic groups, and I'd like to remind you that none of that happened before the Crimean reunification with Russia. In the Russian Crimea, there is a legal policy to observe language equality and diversity. Ethnic Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars are represented together with Russians in local authorities. There is a growth of Crimean Tatars in regional and local parliaments. One of the achievements of federal and republic authorities is a number of documentation of illegal, before 2014, religious sites of Crimean Tatar, and this issue is now being solved. After reunification of Crimea with Russia, there was a policy to return such buildings to the communities with their further restoration at the expense of the state, when before the building was mainly conducted by with the funds of foreign sponsors, international foundations, and private charity of foreign citizens. Muslims of the peninsula are successfully integrated in the Russian community, and now there is a greater amount of people who can afford themselves to do a Hajj. Before 2014, it was 120 people, and now pilgrims are receiving tremendous financial aid. They have a quota of 270 pilgrims right now. There is an actively functioning Millet People and TV channel and radio channel Vetan Homeland, financed through a regional budget. The past 3 years testify that despite anti-Crimean restrictions by a number of Western countries, there is great interest by foreign business and political and social and civil community to development the ties with the peninsula. The efforts of Russian authorities in providing socio-economic development of peninsula, the inter-religious peace, and the respect for rights of the peoples in the peninsula were appreciated by those who visited Crimea. That is, more than 70 events with international component, including festivals, art festivals, and forums in cultural and humanitarian sphere. Well, the very life itself has proven that the decision of the citizens of the peninsula was right. The decision to reunify with Russia, and today's development of Crimea and overcoming of those issues that they could not have done alone, only highlights the truth behind the free expression of the will of the Crimeans when they've chosen their destiny.
There is another glorious date, Mark, which is coming for 12 years, the Special Commission of UN, and afterwards the Commission on inspections of the UN tried to find chemical weapons and other weapon stockpiles concealed and hidden in Iraq. And the White House was claiming that it was the case, and Baghdad declined that. In February 2003, Colin Powell, the then Secretary of State at the UN Security Council, accused the Iraqi leadership of producing the WMD and proved as evidence, protruded the test tube with white powder with anthrax spores found allegedly in Iraq under the pretext of a need to eliminate the notorious weapons. On the 12th of March 2003, US and their allies breaching the international law, invaded Iraq. What happened to Iraq and its legitimate president and its people? You all know the legitimate president, Saddam Hussein, was toppled and executed afterwards, and the country was plunged in many years of internal military and political conflict, and they cannot fully recover from that even now. That was not a natural conflict inherent for any nation or country for a number of reasons. No, that was a conflict that happened in the context of the US occupation and Western occupation of that soil, and with direct incitement and instigation of the West by the Western countries of this conflict without any valid reason. Actually, there was no WMD found in Iraq as a result. Coming to the original assumption, Baghdad was right. They had no WMD. And the criminal activities of the Western countries, their leaders tried to justify by the inaccurate data from their own intelligence services. I just want to remind you that Western countries that were part of the anti-Iraqi coalition had no border on Iraq. Neither the US nor Poland or UK, few people recall that now, but even Ukraine sent their servicemen to wage a war in Iraq. And when the leaders on the bank of a street are now advocating for the international law, I want just to remind and tell them that they should recall what happened when the Kyiv regime trampled upon the international laws, sending their servicemen, not doctors or medical personnel, but servicemen, to wage a war in Iraq against Iraqis on their soil. Had anyone thought about the international law? And now something that you may be struck by. I mentioned it on several occasions, and I will once again repeat that. Among those who were sent there to wage war by the Kyiv regime to fight Iraqis on the Iraqi soil, one of these people was a sharpshooter sniper, Nadezhda Savchenko. You recall her being made a superstar in the West, a pacifist, presented as a pacifist, a person born, as they said, to protect human rights, the rights of Ukraine and the regime. That very Nadezhda Savchenko, sharpshooter, that was brought to prison in this country, in our country, for killing a journalist, had waged a war in Iraq. She was condemned in this country. According to the Western sources, I emphasize it is Western sources, as a result of the invasion and ensuing occupation, the number of people who lost their lives in Iraq was from 100 to 205,000 people, and the indirect losses were around 650,000 people. Those were the data we received from official structures, more or less. When NGOs try to reckon the number of casualties among civilians, they have much greater figures. They state that no one ever tried to calculate all the victims, and anyway, they say it is much above 1 million people. These were not Iraqi military, not servicemen. not someone who served in the regular army or was a mercenary or was in the special services. Those were civilians, peaceful ones, who had lost their lives as a result of the American campaign. Also, the destruction of basic infrastructure and the growth in crime rates also were the after effects, and that resulted in a profound and lengthy socioeconomic crisis. The number of Iraqi refugees fleeing to Syria and Jordan, most primarily, reached 1.5 million people, just imagine, and the internally displaced persons were as numerous as 2 million people. Washington ignored the reports of the International Committee of the Red Cross on cruel treatment of Iraqi prisoners and the reports by Human Rights Watch and other NGOs. They said that the American servicemen were involved in rape and torture and killings of civilians. Americans tried to silence almost and hush down almost everything about all the facts about the Abu Ghraib and Camp Bucca prisons torture practices and what has been made public by the WikiLeaks Iraq dossier. But the truth was finally became known and came to the fore, and Julian Assange, who has fallen victim of the American arbitrary policies, created this website and placed the content there. In December 2020, the US President Donald Trump, despite condemnation of the UN Working Group on the Use of Mercenaries, pardoned 4 members of the notorious PMC Blackwater that were culprits of the killing of 14 civilians on the Nisu Square in Baghdad in 07. One of the tragic results against destroying the statehood of Iraq and its military, economic, and social foundations is the irreparable damage inflicted upon the cultural, historical heritage of Iraq after the siege of Baghdad by the Americans on the 9th of April. Looting and marauding was anyway rampant, and definitely they pillaged the archaeological legacy and heritage of Iraq. What was documented were numerous cases of artifacts, smuggling and trafficking. All that was looted was exported and now has become part of the private collections. Has anyone tried to take stock what has been pillaged and moved away from Iraq? Definitely not. That will forever be part of the private collections, as well as what the British took away from Greece or other Western marauders from Egypt. No matter how numerous the claims and pleas of the nations of origin might be, the answer is uniform. That does not belong to you anymore, they say, they respond. And they also pillaged the Acropolis in Athens, and the Western diplomats, resorting to their immunity, seized and moved away everything that they could to the British Museum. American servicemen were smuggling and trafficking artifacts and antiques during all the occupation period. Planes full of artifacts took off at the behest of relevant structures and private collectors in the United States. The approximate number of artifacts and items missing, according to the National Museum of Iraq, is 15,000. Currently, no more than 6,000 items was returned. But we know quite well that this is only what has been assessed and reckoned and computed. But think of what has been pillaged and destroyed. It will never ever be returned or analyzed properly. So huge the scale of the atrocities and outrage is. They destroyed the traditional lifestyles that were built for centuries, and the country has turned into a hotbed of regional instability, and on its soil the notorious terrorist group ISIS was further born. This is what I wanted to say about the historical memory and what is done there on the West. In the West, on the 9th of March, the legislature of Sofia decided to dismantle a monument to the Soviet Army in the center of the capital. The mayor addressed the governor to give him a go-ahead to move the monument elsewhere. Definitely this barbaric initiative is sponsored by the Euro-Atlanticists, definitely in the view of the upcoming elections. Some of the power aspirants want to demonstrate their ability to be receptive of the needs and interests of the Western partners of theirs. And now this bargaining chip is a monument to those who liberated Bulgaria. Well, head of the current provisional government of Bulgaria urged to postpone this delicate matter till the post-election period. He could not just say, he had no political will to say, hands off the monument to those who made it possible for the current generations to live. Not live in comfort, but it's about the existence, the survival of the current generations, definitely. And the grassroots Bulgarians human chained the monument, and we heeded that, and it was a blasphemous undertaking by the authorities. This feat, this outburst of the Bulgarian nationals is patriotic in essence, and it demonstrates that despite the frenzied anti-Russian propaganda, people cannot be indifferent to the neo-Nazism that has raised its head in Ukraine. They revere the heroic acts of the Russian soldier who brought peace and justice and freedom. Definitely this is a collective image, but when we speak about the heroic acts of the Soviet people, the multi-ethnic, multi-religious Soviet people that did not take sides, that had no divisions, that had no friends or foes, rights and wrongs, that did not care about the shade of color of someone's skin. They just knew that they had their kin and kith that were to be protected, the dispossessed, subject to torture, inhumane torture. And there is the enemy. They knew who had done the life of the humankind intolerable back in the middle of the 20th century, and the survival of everyone in peril was at stake. We are grateful to the nationals of Bulgaria who stood to protect the monument. We believe it's a proof of the long-lasting historical ties between our nations. Well, there is place for heroic acts even today. Nowadays, we're looking at the campaign of the activists of the Russian-speaking community. In 2022, Germany was plunged into a wave of Russophobia provoked by the German media, aggressive rhetoric of the officials and politicians, and it was extinguished thanks to the compatriots of ours, Russian speakers, and Russian culture is native for them. Now they try to avenge, these German authorities. The prosecutor's office of Cologne tries to put up criminal charges against a native of Dnipropetrovsk, an activist of Russian community, Ilyana Kolbasnikova, for her speaking up in favor of Russia on the 8th of March. And she's threatened with 9 years of 3 years of imprisonment, and the hearing is scheduled for the 29th of March 2023, and everybody, all the media show their glee on the exposure of the so-called Kremlin agent by the authorities of the Federative Republic of Germany. Definitely, we express our solidarity with the Russian-German community, Russian-speaking German community. We definitely join the words of support against those persecuted by our, as we've previously thought, German partners, and now we know who these people are. The other day, a commission on radio television of Lithuania prescribed that Russian TV channel IP addresses must be blocked, including Russia 1, Russia 24, RTR Planet, and TVN First Channel TV chains, in case it is not committed by the private companies. The media regulator threatens private entities with liability, and they produce huge fines to both natural and legal persons. These are Democrats, liberals. You recall how what slogans they used back in the USSR, later USSR times, when those civic activists used different slogans to shake the situation in the Baltic republics. They said that the freedom of word was lacking and no one could listen to all existent media, and they wanted the pluralism and civil rights protection. How many years passed since then, I wonder? 100, 200, 2 million years passed since then. No, just a couple of decades only, since mid-80s. These are the same people in the Baltics, the very same people, not someone else. They are now closing down media outlets. 5 years ago, they said that those outlets were breaching something, invented pretexts saying that the political analysts misinterpreted something and that a program would not reflect properly a position, a stand. They do not need any pretexts now. They just close outlets down and they persecute journalists like Murat Kasim, and in Latvia he was imprisoned. Yesterday he had a birthday, and we all congratulated him, wished him a happy birthday. Well, the day before yesterday, and we launched an info support campaign. But what is happening to these victims? And what is happening to those people, the very same people, in the course of their life, are now advocating for quite opposite things, with gloat and glee and jeering, saying that they needed anything and everything in the info space, and no one had a right to move them away from the info sources, and that they have a right to perceive all the information, and it is them who can select information.
And these very people, in these very countries, with the same zeal, are closing down the media and blocking not only the broadcasting channel, analog and digital, but also the possibility to watch it online. Well, I'd like to remind you that in this case, we're not talking about something that could have a mass coverage, for example. If it was the second most popular TV channel in their country, then they would feel threatened. But this is the global network, internet, where anyone who can find what's interesting to him without any mass influence by this mass media. People should have at least some kind of a freedom to choose the sources of information, but not. How can this be? How come we're witnessing this happening? I do not know, but I think it's very important to say it. The frenzied attempts by the Lithuanian regime to completely isolate their media space from any information they don't want by total censorship is now using rolling blocking of websites proves yet again that it's completely helpless and afraid that people are naturally have a natural strive to shape their own perception of what's happening in the country and in the world and not make do with the aggressive top-down Russophobic campaign. Despite all the attempts to silence the uncomfortable truth, it is impossible. It's simply impossible in the modern world. The local citizens bringing en masse flowers to the downed Russian tank, as it was called when it was installed in the Lithuanian capital, that only proves my idea. The direct outcome of yet another act of censorship of the Lithuanian leadership is showing disrespect to the citizens and their rights and interests. Rights and interests which were not imposed on Lithuanian people and the government, but they elaborated themselves. Well, otherwise, this Lithuanian regime is not legally elected, but rather a dictatorship. These are all the laws that have been adopted voluntarily without pressuring, without imperial influence, as they usually call it. No, they did it themselves. Well, if they did it themselves, if they adopted all these laws, why violate them? There is an apparent unwillingness and lack of desire to ensure the freedom of speech and media pluralism. It is apparent. There is an apparent chronicle legal nihilism of Lithuania and impossibility to live up to the lofty ideals from great podiums. As for positive news, on the 2nd of March, Astana Opera hosted a grand opening of the Festival of Russian Art and Culture, Russian Seasons. There was a concert, Tchaikovsky Gala, exhibition Planeta Tchaikovsky, prepared by the Russian National Museum of Music. Throughout the year, there will be also screenings, creative labs, classes by leading cultural institutions of Russia, as well as tours by the Russian theaters dedicated to 125 years since the establishment of the Moscow Art Public Theater by Konstantin Stanislavski and Vladimir Nemirovich Danchenko. This large-scale and socially oriented project, initiated by the Russian Ministry of Culture in 2017, brings back world-renowned Russian Seasons by the impresario Sergei Diaghilev, but with a modern twist. This festival is opening new horizons for international cultural cooperation. Recently, Bulgaria held a campaign, Write a Letter to the Russian Warrior Liberator, dedicated to 145 years since the liberation of Bulgaria from Ottomanic yoke during the Russian-Turkish War 1877-1878. Our embassy in Sofia received postcards, letters, touching children drawings, as well as Bulgarian talismans, Martinica for Russian servicemen in the special military operation. These sincere and heartfelt messages were important to the hearts for our soldiers at the forefront, who today, like their great forefathers during the Second World War, courageously stand up to the Nazism nurtured by the West. Thank you to all of those who took part in this campaign. I would like to thank participants and organizers of this campaign. I'd like to direct attention to the Eurasian Economic Commission, together with the Agency for Strategic Initiatives in promoting new projects, that they are holding the first International Climate Award, Green Eurasia, which is called to be one of the main events in climate sphere on the territory of the Eurasian Economic Union. One of the main tasks of this call is to promote effective climate technologies to ensure sustainable development within the Eurasian Economic Union in such spheres as energy, industry, agriculture, construction, finance, and so on. The competition is the following: clean energy, energy efficiency, clean industry, sustainable agriculture, low-carbon transportation, green construction, green finance, effective waste management, environmentally friendly culture and public engagement, environmental and climate monitoring, public policy in low-carbon development. Commercial and non-commercial organizations, as well as public institutions and citizens, are called to participate. In order to do that, before the 31st of March, fill an application at the website of Eurasian Economic Commission, and you will see a link in today's briefing text. Winners and finalists in each nomination will be chosen by the expert group and the Presidium. The awarding ceremony will take place on the margins of the Second Eurasian Economic Forum on the 24th, 25th of March in Moscow. Several other important dates annually. On the 21st of March, the global community celebrates the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, declared by the UN General Assembly in 1966. The Russian Federation resolutely condemns all manifestations of discrimination and intolerance based on race, color of skin, ethnic, or national background. We have to state, regrettably, that despite the harsh lessons of the Second World War and shameful legacy of colonialism in different parts of the world, we yet again see a growing number of different manifestation of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and intolerance, related intolerance. False notions of national and racial supremacy in certain states become the foundation for national identity and policy, and ideology becoming systemic, permeating all authorities and all spheres of society. To that end, and attempts are made to rewrite history, revise, and distort the outcomes of the Second World War. In this context, we believe that it is unacceptable, sacrilegious, and cynical that there are biased campaigns in certain countries to glorify in all forms of the Nazi past, of the Nazi movement, neo-Nazism, including by building monuments and memorials and holding public meetings, as well as making heroes out of the members of Waffen-SS organizations and those who fought against anti-Hitler coalition and collaborated with Nazis. We believe that the most effective instrument to prevent the rebirth and the spread of this ideology is to maintain the truth and the memory about the enduring feat of those who gave their lives to fight Nazism during the Second World War. To that end, the Russian Federation annually introduces a resolution combating glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices that contribute to fueling contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance at the UN General Assembly. Unrelenting fight against contemporary forms of racism, including such ugly forms as neo-Nazism, should be an absolute priority for the whole global community. And on the 21st of March, we're celebrating 33 years since the Declaration of Independence by the Republic of Namibia. Europeans started exploring this territory in the middle of the 19th century. In 1878, the English took over their control of the Walfish Bay town. Over the rest of the territory of the modern Namibia, in the 1890s, the German colony was established over that territory. It was called German Southwestern Africa and continued for 30 years. From 1904 to 1907. The indigenous people rebelled against the German colonial administration. It was suppressed, leaving dead 65,000 people, up to 80% of Guerrero tribe, and 10,000 people, 50% of the Nama tribe. In 1960, the Namibian Patriotic Forces created Southwest Africa People's Organization, which started a fight for the independence of the country, supported by the UN. And in 1967, the UN Council on Southwestern Africa was created, and it was later called Council on Namibia. It is telling that the Independence Day coincides with another important date, 33 years since the establishment of the Russian-Namibian diplomatic relations. Our country was one of the first to reach out a helping hand to the Namibian people in their fight for independence and self-determination. In 1960s and 80s, the Soviet Union provided military, financial, and organizational support, provided special equipment, transportation, small arms and light weapons, and ammunition to the SWAPO, as well as trained them on the USSR territory. The first presidential and parliamentary elections in the country took place in November 1989, with SWAPO winning the election. And on the 21st of March 1990, the independence of the Republic of Namibia was declared. Since that time, the bilateral relations between our country saw an upward trend. We have tremendous potential of cooperation in different spheres: geology, mining, diamond complex, hydropower, agriculture, fisheries, transportation, tourism, education. Intergovernmental Russian-Namibian Commission for Trade and Economic Cooperation is actively working. We'd like to congratulate our friends in that country with their national holiday, and we wish every success and well-being to the people of Namibia. Yet another tragic topic, tragic date. On the 22nd of March, we are to celebrate a sorrowful date that has to do with the history in the Second World War. This day, 80 years ago, the fascist executioners burned down the Belarus village of Katyn, and the local citizens, 149, 75 of them were children. It was a miracle that some witnesses survived this terrible, inhumane massacre. And thanks to them and their accounts, it was possible to establish the details of those terrible and tragic events. Katyn is remembered by the millions of people, not only in Russia and brother nation of Belarus, but around the world. Still, it is not the only settlement that suffered from the hands of Nazis. Its sorrowful fate was shared by tens of thousands of settlements and villages on occupied territories. For example, the Bryansk settlement called Hatsun. The burning down of Hatyn and execution of the local citizens was done not only by the German war criminals. It was the key part in this bloodshed was played by the Nazi henchmen, especially Ukrainian collaborationists who pledged allegiance to Hitler. Some of them, unfortunately, managed to get lost in our vast country or in the West, where they felt rather safe. It is telling that the Belarus investigators, with the support from Russian colleagues, even today are finding traces of the henchmen of Katyn and find their atrocities and crimes. We are sure that such crimes should have no statute of limitations. After the end of the Great Patriotic War, it seemed that the brown plague has receded once and for all, and humanity will never come across the cruel manifestation of fascism. Unfortunately, yet again, we have to stand up to this threat. The West is trying to disregard, rather stubbornly, the growing neo-Nazism in Ukraine and the Baltic states, and are openly conniving at the spread of Russophobic ideology among pseudo-democratic regimes championed by them. The contemporary Ukrainian nationalism has shown its savage face. For example, remember the burning down of the trade union hall on the 2nd of May 2014, where 50 civilians were burned alive there, and some media are quite justified in calling it the second Katyn. No one should have any doubt left about that there was no need for justification for a special military operation and the vital need to achieve its goals and ends. Well, I told you about 50 people. Well, we're talking about the figure of about 50 people. But what is surprising, this savage cruelty during the time how they mocked the victims. And now I'm prepared to answer your questions. Do we have International Life with us? Yes, hello. Last week, Polish authorities had a joint statement and they asked to increase the price cap on oil from Russia. How would you comment to that? They called to decrease the price cap on the oil from Russia. Well, contrary to the traditional rhetoric about being committed to the market mechanism in the West, well, you remember how we were taught that the economy must be liberal, it should regulate itself, the hand of the market and market foundations. Well, contrary to this traditional rhetoric, the West, led by Washington, went on to create a buyer's cartel. They have introduced a price cap on crude oil and oil products. Well, I remind you once again what it compares to. Well, so maybe next time you can try to organize a buyer's cartel when you go grocery shopping. Take about 5 or 7 people with you, and now you say that now you'll buy milk, cheese, and butter, not at the prices that are written down there and not considering the discounts, but at the prices that you believe to be right. Because you have put a price cap on butter, cheese, and milk. You know what will be done to you at the shop? I guess you can guess. As for calls of such small-scale energy market players as Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania are just trying to please their champions from over the ocean, they're trying to punish Russia at any cost. In essence, this initiative is out of touch with economic reality. Well, they're not the countries who can afford themselves to conduct such irresponsible policy. When a country is a responsible player, when it understands that there are many factors informing its decisions, no one would afford themselves such actions. Well, not out of fear or being sensitive, but because of responsibility. The possible downward adjustment of price caps would only lead to further escalation of instability on global energy markets towards greater instability and dismantling of the rest of the rules of international trade. As you know, Russia does not agree with this, and on the 27th of December 2022, the presidential decree stipulates a ban on supplying oil upon the contracts which have a price cap. And we intend to continue to respond to illegal restrictions introduced against us by hostile states. Well, look at what's happening in the U.S. 3 banks gone bankrupt. Swiss regulators are saving the second most important bank because it simply received this blowback from the U.S. bank. But, well, I haven't seen the domino effect yet, but they're saying that the banking system in the West is already feeling the brunt of this blow. Well, they better deal with these issues instead of undermining everything that is at least functioning somehow without their interference. If Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, if they feel that they're strong enough and financially strong enough to bring more stability to the world, well, they can support the U.S. banks that have collapsed. Or maybe the Swiss bank. Any other questions? Yes? Thank you for the comment. How could you comment the recent statements by the Prime Minister of Estonia, Madam Kallas, who compared airstrikes of the Soviet air forces in 1944 on Estonia, occupied by the Hitler's Germany? How do they compare with the military actions of Russia in Ukraine?
I must say that the strikes of the Soviet aviation in March 1944 against fascist targets in Narva, Tallinn, were part of the Red Army's offensive operation to liberate the Estonian Soviet Republic from the Nazi occupation. By the by, in that operation, the infantry corps, 8th Infantry Corps, the Estonian origin, was quite active in that offensive. The Baltic region was of strategic importance for Germany, well, definitely with respect to supplies of foodstuffs and refined products and liaison with Northern Europe, and definitely the Soviet army impacted primarily the headquarters of Gestapo, Abwehr, defense and sea arsenal and munitions. Well, Madam Callas is silent deliberately on the destruction from the air bombing that Estonia suffered on part of the Hitler army, and definitely it's all clear they don't conceal whom they side with, although the Nazi elements were rampant on Estonian soil. We see the opposite now. They do not accuse them. They have taken a different side of the history. They do not conceal that. They don't hide their sympathies, their likings, and she had a party to support in that war. So the affiliation of the Estonian leadership and the Nazi leadership of the Germany is definitely beyond doubt. They want to make heroes out of Shuhevich, Stepan Bandera, and the Estonian thugs from Waffen SS. But her being head of that republic's government is voicing not the official position, probably, but what had been instilled in her from the earliest infancy. That clan, Callas, has been around in power for quite a while, including the Soviet times, so definitely this is something she inherited from her parents and ancestors. And this sentence was pronounced in the Nuremberg process and trial in 1946. These Nazi criminals were condemned. And definitely the verdict will be pronounced against the neo-Nazi criminals of the Kiev regime. Kommersant, are you with us? Hello, Madam Zakharova. We have two questions. Nicola Pashinyan, the Armenian Prime Minister, has expressed fears that Armenia's standing in the CSTO is in peril. He said that CSTO may withdraw from Armenia, not vice versa. And what that may mean, as you think, and whether Russia will take any further steps to iron out differences between the CSTO members. Thank you. Well, you know, when I saw that statement by the Armenian Prime Minister, you quoted him as saying that CSTO, he said, might withdraw from Armenia. When I read these lines, I recalled two other quotes from classics, the writer Bulgakov, who stood upon whom, and the second one belonged to Stanislavski, the theatre director. You should love art inside yourself, not yourself inside art. And probably I will leave this part of question for your further deliberation. Try to understand what those quotes were about, who stood upon whom. But with respect to the second part, on the 13th of September 2022, extraordinary sessions of the CSTO council were held, and a mission with the then Secretary General, Mr. Stanislav Zas, went there, and the chair of the joint staff and the monitoring mission deployment plan was also prepared, and the decision was finalized. But unfortunately, because of the separate requirements of the Armenian colleagues, that decision was not enacted. Well, this is to account for it with facts. So Russia plans no additional moves in this respect on its part. I told you what was done in the past. If there are any other attempts to discuss steps, it is a collective security organization, so collective steps are possible. And my second question on the same matter is that Mr. Pashinyan said that Russia is the security guarantor for the Nagorno-Karabakh. The Foreign Ministry of Russia, does it consider this to be true, as the trilateral statement contains no such wording? Yes, I'll stop here. You know, I think nothing should be invented and we shouldn't beat about the bush. All the commitments of our country are enshrined in the text of the trilateral statement as of the 9th of November 2020. You should open that document and read it out loud. And you'll be clear about the obligations and commitments. Russian peacekeepers do their best to prevent escalation and deterioration on the ground within their zone of responsibility. Much hinges on the activities and statements of all the involved parties. We believe these statements should be of constructive nature, aiming at a common success. If something is stated running counter to this principal goal of bringing peace and stability and overcoming difficulties and differences, we, as we emphasize and reiterate, try to be diplomatic in style, not because of the tradition, but, being guided by the principal overarching goal of peace and stability in that region. And each time, behind our statements that may be, a bit too vague and diplomatic, well, there are titanic efforts to maintain peace and stability, huge efforts. And in the Prague summit in October 2022, Armenia undertook some other commitments also. So we'll leave it to the conscience of Armenia to put responsibility for the fate of Nagorno-Karabakh on someone else, on a third party. And I also want to ask another thing. I apologize for interrupting you. Can we consider that the Russian Federation should protect Karabakh even in the event that Azerbaijan would like to take under control new territories that are now controlled by the peacekeepers? The first part of your question was, repeat that, can one consider that the Russian Federation has to protect Karabakh even if Azerbaijan wishes to take over other territories under Russian peacekeeping control now? Prototyping in 3D modeling here would be uncalled for. There are obligations and commitments put on paper, and there is work on the ground. We can only comment what has been happening on the ground in the responsibility area of ours. Speculating on how it might look if something would happen would be wrong altogether. It will lead to speculations and insinuations. If there is something that merits our response, we will definitely provide one. And now, simulating and modeling is dangerous, I think. Moscow Post. Hello, we have several questions. The first is about AUKUS alliance and its impact on the non-proliferation and the NPT treaty. What do your lawyers say? Can it be a matter of an anti-American propagandist campaign? And what about the IAEA, given how they behave in the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant case? Let's look at AUKUS as a whole. Let's consider them comprehensively. We have been watching closely that project. It is not a military and technical platform. It is once again a bloc-based foundation to deploy NATO-centric infrastructure in that region with repercussions for the security and stability in the APR. It is, shattering, upending the balance, the equilibrium of stability there. No one can guarantee the absence of problems, big and small. This is the natural cause of events of life, but there was stability guaranteed in the region, and the equilibrium and alignment of forces guaranteed that. Now we're seeing a classical move of them trying to breach that balance, and the AUKUS plus structure expansion is of our concern. Japan, New Zealand, the Republic of Korea are among the interested parties after the Madrid summit of NATO that was held in June 2022. They launched a new mechanism, established a group of friends of NATO in the APR, the AP4, which is called Quad in acronym. The Tokyo official representatives repeatedly assumed obligations to deploy NATO in the APR. We know why they have been doing that. The country is occupied. The American military bases are deployed there. No democracy is present in that country. They just voice and convey what they are told to say. The Minister of Defense of Japan, after Rob Bauer from the Military Committee of NATO visited Japan, spoke about the pseudo-civil partnerships for the sake of allegedly well-being of different parts of the APR with the same foundations of opposition and countering instead of the key overarching goals of economic integration in the region and non-conflict driven development, joint development. They have been falsifying the civil society. They're establishing quasi-civil structures that will kind in a soft style provide support to the hard power of NATO and the whole of AUKUS. The AUKUS 3, or Troika, together with the partners I named, is a systemic pillar of different military and political tracks that were branded to fit the Indo-Pacific concept. It's about heads of military staffs and heads of military intelligence services of the Indo-Pacific region, as it's called in the West countries. They try to introduce NATO official representatives into the AUKUS staff, and definitely the goals are obvious. They want NATO to embrace one more region that NATO was absent in before, and there was no need of their being on the ground around. So such destructive efforts would be a hindrance to the peaceful development, the capability of which had been piled up over decades, building upon the inclusive stability and security and cooperation mechanisms around ASEAN. But, the West believes it was too peaceful a life. Russia and China coordinate their positions on the international arena closely. We have been analyzing attentively the West's activities in the API, including that AUKUS case. We believe that AUKUS members should abide strictly by the obligations with respect to the non-proliferation of the WMD and its delivery vehicles, rejecting all steps that could potentially destabilize the situation and have a negative impact on the strategic balance. And definitely with respect to the submarine fleet construction for Australia within AUKUS, what the after effects might be, what the repercussions might be, we all know that. And the questions that were raised by the Chinese and us remained unanswered. But these questions are obvious. The nuclear material and the installations will be handed over to the Australians, but they should be under the IAEA guarantees and subject to the NPT. But anyway, mentioning these questions and saying that there are no answers in place, I must say that there is no clarity whatsoever about how these guarantees will be executed and whether the IAEA inspectors will have full access to everything that is related to that submarine project. Once again, I reiterate, we brought up these questions as well as China. Everybody asked these questions. The people, the population of many countries of that region asked their governments how to react and respond on that. What is the take on that? And we publicly raised a question of how it coincides with the green agenda. Australia is called a green continent. It was like Oasis before, an environmentally friendly place. But now, nuclear submarines may end up there. That nation never had the potential, the capability to maintain, create, design these nuclear submarines. What is the relationship between this and all the programs that were called environmental a couple of years ago, eco-friendly? It was a buzzword, and it came always first in all the programs. Have you heard of that? No one heard anything about the eco-friendliness with respect to the nuclear submarine construction project. Definitely they will be stationed in Australia. Do you have any more questions? Yes, I have several more. The second is about Nord Streams and Norway. Well, they are a leader in the offshore undersea deep water works, and they have been spying over the Northern Fleet of Russia, and they're competing with us with respect to the gas supplies to Europe. Can we apply the coinage highly likely whether they're involved in that act of sabotage, and we should stop selling cod at Norwegian ports at the end of the day? With respect to what is related to the fishing, I will refer you to our comment on as of the 10th of February. I will not repeat that. And as regards Nord Streams and the relevant investigation, we have distributed our queries to all the countries that are supposed to be involved. We submitted those questions to the UN Security Council, and they appeared in the public space, proving that we are active in trying to find out the truth. We can hear a lot of fake news and speculations on the media saying that those were private Ukrainian companies. And do they take any more orders, these private Ukrainian companies? That seems absurd. Such an act of sabotage, a deep sea one, against civil infrastructure in the NATO responsibility zone. It is ridiculous to fancy it be committed by divers, snorkelers. Who are these people? How are they called, I wonder? We will require and demand an international investigation, and we will try to arrive at the truth. We will ask questions. We will proceed with our own investigation with unflagging attention paid to that. Actually, frankly speaking, we are living in the first quarter of the 21st century, and that quarter is nearing an end. So there has been quite a while that we lived in the 21st century, but I cannot recall anything similar in scale to that act of sabotage with the gas pipelines. And if we don't take war times, I could also not recall anything similar. We had horrible acts of terrorism that claimed hundreds of lives with destructive and, ostentatious terrorist attacks.
But as for the destruction of civilian infrastructure, which is providing energy to the whole continent, also done at the level accessible and available only to special services which have the necessary equipment for that, I cannot remember such a case, because naturally here we're talking about an involvement not of private institutions, economic actors or anything, but we're talking about institutions which have to have such capacities, and no private organization without strong support by special services is incapable of such an act. If you're done, no, one more question, please. A question about eviction of monks from the Kiev-Pechorsky Lavra. Is Russia going to raise this question in international organizations? Russia has already done it. I'd like to repeat once again that our UN mission, the ambassador there and the rest of them are working actively on this matter. At the UN, UNESCO, and OSCE platforms are also engaged. It's done in the public space, and we also are doing diplomatic work. As I have already said, on the 14th of March, Foreign Minister Lavrov sent letters to UN General Secretary, OSCE Chair in person, General Secretary of the OSCE, UN General Assembly Chair. Similar letters have been sent by the special representative of the minister, by Mr. Askaldovich, to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, ODIHR Director, UN Secretary General Aid for Human Rights, personal representative of OSCE Chairperson in Office on Combating Racism, Xenophobia, Discrimination, as well as other representatives and other institutions. Thank you. Last question. Do you expect to have contacts with the State Department of the U.S. dedicated to the incident with the drone over the Black Sea? As you know, Russian Ambassador Antonov was invited to the State Department on the 14th of March, where he refused all the insinuations against Russian armed forces. And he said that the drone, which with transponders off, violated the borders of the temporary regime of limitations on the use of airspace due to a special military operation, and all stakeholders were informed according to the current norms and regulations. I'd like to say that upon the initiative of the U.S. side, contacts were held on this matter between ministers of defense and heads of chiefs of staff of the countries. You can read on the Ministry of Defense website and their social networks about the statement about this conversation. We think that the lines of communication should remain open, and we do so. We're for cooperation to the benefit of our nations, but we know how to stand up for these interests. Once again, please pay attention to the comment by the Foreign Minister Lavrov. It's also on our website. Do we have China Media Corporation with us? Yes. Hello. We have two questions today. Recently, two banks have closed down in the U.S., and Secretary of Finance admitted that it had to do mainly with the hikes in interest rate, but that caused troubles to these two banks. As it's written in CNN, one thing for sure, that it's not about the interest hike, but it has to do with their domestic policy. Well, I don't think it's up to Russia or the Russian ministry to comment on this matter, but whether it's the beginning or the end of the pinnacle of a recession, well, I think that we have to remind ourselves that the questions about the recession in the U.S. asked by the journalists to the Biden administration, and it cannot answer those questions. As Biden's press secretary said that if you don't say the word recession, it will not happen. But if you do mention it, then it might occur. Well, that's a very convenient position, isn't it? Well, I don't think we have a task to comment on it. Well, there is no issue because no one is speaking about it or should not speak about it. As for the stage of the recession, whether it's happening in the U.S. economy, I think this is up to U.S. and international economic specialists for them to comment on it. But I don't think it's a question for our ministry. Still, it is apparent that the U.S. experts and citizens are indeed trying to get evaluation of the situation from the Biden's administration. Unfortunately, they're not succeeding. Indeed, we're closely following this topic, considering the share of the U.S. in global trade and finance. It can have a very immediate impact on the whole global economy. We've seen it happen before. Yet again, G20 was established as a response to the global economic crisis caused by the collapse of the U.S. Bubble on the immobilities market. Well, as usual, if this crisis spills outside of the U.S., the least developed countries and the most vulnerable population will suffer the most. According to the information that we have today, right now we don't see this domino effect, as I think I've mentioned it before. Still, the markets have already responded to the collapse of these American banks. I cannot rule anything out, but yet again, I think this is the topic for discussion of economists and specialists. Still, we see that this situation is showing loss of trust to dollar as a savings currency, a reliable savings currency, and risk hedging tool. Before, in any case of uncertainty, and we remember it well, when the market was being unpredictable, investors used to invest into U.S. Treasury bonds and U.S. dollars. Well, this time something went wrong. It is apparent that the domestic and foreign policy of the U.S. administration has an impact on the financial system of the country, its relevance in global scale, and resilience. We've watched many years of fights throughout the electoral cycle, and this is a ruthless fight, but not a destruction of political opponents, which would be logical, but destruction of everything that could be beneficial for the destruction of the opponent. Be that economy, humanitarian spheres, agreements, treaties, everything will be cut down. The lack of attention to domestic issues of the state, with the highlight of external issues, as they call it, seems to have played a certain role in the trends that we're seeing right now in the American economy and the banking system. Well, forgive me, but these sanctions experiments, for example, doesn't it have a boomerang effect? It's like throwing a stone in the sea. Well, I guess it would make some waves, but it will not come back to you. Well, this is not just a stone, not just a sea. In many cases, unilateral sanctions and prohibitive measures, especially when it has to do with certain restrictions in the energy sphere, in the banking services, that has a tremendous destructive force for themselves, and not as a whiplash, but simply destructive force and consequences. How many people saved their money and were using foreign banks for trading in services and to pay for them? They were simply cut off the system, of this payment system. Insurance, hedging, and payment systems, everything, simply because the U.S. ministry decided to do that. Who thought about it? Well, no one. We all know about continued disbalances and risks, including a tremendous level of public debt. Please remind me how many trillions of dollars of debt they have accumulated. This is a sky-high figure. Record deficit of trade balance, budget deficit, and so on. As the U.S. economists are saying themselves, and this is not propaganda and not my desire to troll or mock, but these are the facts voiced by the U.S. expert. Everything is being held down by the printing press of the dollar, which is largely being issued in order to cover the issues, to compensate. This unbacked dollar mass is being printed, and this policy of living on grand scale at the cost of others simply by printing press and issuing to the national and global economy of unbacked dollars, simultaneously manipulating the interest rate by the FRS, is bound to fail. And at some point in time, it will have a catastrophic consequences. Maybe what's happening is a harbinger of what's to come. There are also questions to be asked of the extolled control bodies of the U.S. They were saying only the U.S. bodies can evaluate which bank is good or bad, which one is corrupt, where something's right or something's wrong. Where are these oversight bodies? Why they're not doing their direct responsibilities, reporting and verification, so on. 3 banks right away, and this is not a result of a catastrophe, technological issues, or an emergency. Nope. International rating agencies and auditing companies created using the U.S. mold. Where are they? Where is their analysis and conclusions? It's very interesting. And those who are working right now, for example, on some dissertations and whatnot, just look up U.S. analysts of the leading analytic agencies and rating agencies. Have they forecast this collapse, this failure? Well, that would be telling a very objective evaluation of their value for the market, because they were very scrupulous in checking the reporting of these banks. Well, either they failed or the banks failed. There is bound to be a mistake somewhere here. They continued to give the green light to their continued successful and effective financial activity. It's an open question. How many are there? How many such banks are there with so-called stellar reputation and reporting have been created by the U.S. institutions with a long-term cheap money, sometimes with cases of negative interest rates, helped cover the shortcomings and financial holes through refinancing of the loans, and that seemed logical and simple. But the situation has changed. Capital markets have run dry. They have become more expensive. Interest rate went up in the fight against inflation. And where did inflation come from? From the same place. On the one hand, there was the pandemic, where major capital has created a tremendous amount of issues. They also had to keep up the electorate and some kind of money, or I don't know, some kind of bonds, or I don't know what to call them. There were some kind of tickets that were like money. Well, it was unbacked by anything, and everyone understood it. That was the first wave. Later, the sanctions came, and the globalized international economic system cannot but have a boomerang effect, especially since they were aimed at the largest players, Russia, China, and others, because we are also an economic center. We have connections with a tremendous amount of countries. This is, on the surface, this is a very simple calculus 101. This is basically kindergarten math. When you, well, that's the level of the situation. And you have to understand the mentality of the so-called Western democracies. It's very short term. What's important right now is important. Short-term result is the most important thing, and what will happen within a week is not interesting. Remember a famous phrase which belongs to the Away with the Wind Scarlett O'Hara protagonist. I'll think about it tomorrow. This postponed desire to think, the need to analyze something very important later, maybe. Well, sometimes maybe that works in life, but for sure not in these matters. Not in the matters that have offered the rest of the world to play like a roulette. This is a very sensitive topic. Yet again, you have to understand that the failure and collapse of the U.S. financial system, stock, everything, well, all these conglomerations will not just remain within the national borders. Think back to 2008 and other years. Think about collapse on the Hong Kong stock exchange. Well, what happened? And how did that have an impact on the world? Well, you cannot help but see the trend. This is dangerous and wrong, and this trend is apparent. This manipulation of the liberal economy. This is an impact of political processes on economy. This is violation of laws underpinning finance and economy, and this is the sphere of law. Neither the laws of legislation, that what kind of effect that it has. You said that you have another question. Yes, well, you've touched upon it, right? That this month the US, UK, and Australia had a joint statement that Australia is going to buy up to 5 US nuclear submarines, and that will make Australia the 7th country in the world with a submarine fleet, nuclear submarine fleet. What do you think? Is there a need for such submarines for Australia, and what kind of ramifications it would have? Well, I've commented on that, but I'll give you some more details. It was announced by President Biden on the 13th of March with leaders of the UK and Australia. They're talking about the action plan of the AUKUS partnership to create nuclear submarine fleet for Australian Navy. It stipulates, well, just think about it. It foresees that Canberra purchases, that Australia purchases, Canberra purchases in midterm up to 5 submarines. How does it happen? Usually the state declares what it needs. There are domestic strategic plans for development and plans of actions, budgets, and so on. If the state for that needs to sign a contract with other countries, there are bilateral agreements. But just think of it. They're creating this trio, the US, the UK, and Australia, and this is Anglo-Saxon world that's calling Australia, write it down. You are planning to purchase from us up to 5 submarines, and we'll see what will happen later. But you know, you need nuclear submarines, and don't ask questions why you didn't have them before. You didn't have them before, but now you're writing down and highlighted. You really need them. Note it down so you don't forget how to explain it to your population. It suggests a forward bases of US submarines in the region, training Australian military for operating these submarines and creating the necessary infrastructure in Australia. And who would it all belong to? Is it British? Is it US? Well, for sure, this is not Australian infrastructure. They would have just a tangential relation to it, in as much as they're allowed to. Do we have such examples? Yes. nuclear sharing by the U.S. On the territory of the EU countries. Italy has stationed nuclear weapons. Does Italy have anything to do that? Can they manage it? Are they asked should it be updated or not? Are they shown any kind of launching systems or anything? No, they've deployed it there, and it will be forever. The same thing here. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Australia took part in all major conflicts on the side of Washington and London. An Australian fleet was active from the Antarctic to the Northern Sea. Therefore, the strategic balance will shift not only in the Asia-Pacific region. Transfer of submarines to Australia is nothing more than an instrument how to offload a number of costs on the support of the U.S. military to Canberra. Can you remember such examples? Yes. Think about President Trump. Remember he traveled to NATO and said, well, 2% GDP, that's what you have to pay. And he said, well, we're helping you defend yourselves. That costs money. And now it costs 2% of your GDP. What can be said? Well, nothing. Not because they don't have an understanding what's happening, or they don't have an abacus or a calculator, or they don't want to live independently. No, they have it all, but all the territories of these countries, they're military bases, and some of them have nuclear weapons. Indeed, it paralyzes your will.
So the evident goals are not concealed. It's about interaction for the participating countries to ramp up their military capability, ascribing it to the threats allegedly emanating from Russia, China, and DPRK in the APR. Definitely the main benefactor would be Washington here, selling submarines and expanding its military presence, and its allies will flag new alliances, helping Washington to handle and service its own self-interested goals. And once again, the agenda, the green agenda, it is the main thing as we gather from the Democrat strategy. Off we go. Reuters, are you with us? Good afternoon, good evening. I just have a question and two clarifications that appeared on the feed of the outlets since we started the briefing. So the grain deal, in case it is extended still, how shall the MFA force the compliance of the Russian part of the transaction? Do you assess these methods or attempts to implement the Russian part of the transaction as efficient, or there may be other means and ways? Our methods are negotiations, diplomacy, and other things related. These are the methods that we will apply. The toolkit provides ample opportunities, we hope, for necessary effect. Thank you. And with respect to the grain deal, a while ago, news appeared on feeds of news agencies. It said that a representative said that the text of the agreement stipulates a 120 days extension instead of 60 days, as Russian representatives claim. The deal is extended by 60 days. 60 days, but the UN says it should be extended by 120. Well, they say they don't know. This very person says he doesn't know what is happening in the Kiev-Pechorskaya Lora. Probably he might be incompetent. It's only a guess. Another point with respect to the grain deal, a piece of news appeared an hour ago that International Commission on Investigation of the Ukrainian happenings said that Russian military committed indiscriminate attacks and killings and slaughtering, which is not the first statement of that kind. But what is your take on that? I must see the entire text of the document, but you're right, we hear quite often such accusations and allegations. They began not only in 2022, they began much earlier. We were blamed for everything and anything, for selling and transiting gas, including via Ukraine, and contracts took long nights to approve and coordinate, and everybody accused us for selling, not giving it away, I mean the gas. And, the political turmoil was also blamed on us, I mean the Ukrainian infighting, and entire segments of the Ukrainian society had a wish to develop interaction, cooperation with Russia, and we were to blame once again. And we were to blame for looking at Ukraine and regarding them as a sovereign state paying for the lease of the military base for the Black Sea Fleet of ours. We are always to blame for everything. But despite all the deplorable outcomes of the Western experiments on Ukrainian soil, neither different regimes of Kiev nor those behind those regimes never have any or had any responsibility. Is there a person now in existence who will say that the Ukrainian Security Service and the Ukrainian army are brilliant knights without fear or reproach and doubt? Will anyone be able to say so? No. Those who are behind such news and reports should find their bearings, whether they advocate for impartiality or not. If so, we will be able to provide facts, data, and evidence. But if they respond with a different answer, with a no, if they say they only cater to others and they only handle and service others' interests, no need to respond on our part. But anyway, we will provide a comment. We'll once again study the text, but arguing is worth only with those who can hear you, with those who can find the truth and looking for the truth and are in pursuit of the truth. Let's take the Bucha case, and we send queries about the specific lists of those who perished there, and no one could provide any evidence to us. There was no point in talking about the Malay Boeing for years. Almaz and Tay and others provided evidence, and the debris were scattered, and no one wanted to collect the debris. Only after we worked hard to attract everyone's attention, a rescue team went there. And no point arguing with those who wouldn't let you participate in investigation. Malaysia was not admitted to the investigation of the Boeing crash. Same refers to Salisbury. These were our nationals, and we were not allowed to participate. We were barred from the investigation. No one answered our questions. Well, poisoning of Navalny. Well, Navalny is a Russian citizen, and we sent inquiries to the prosecutor's office in Berlin, and we received no answers whatsoever. And Nord Stream 1 and 2, it was a joint project with our gas. Once again, we are not allowed to participate. We only can see stovepiping and fake news and media machinations. So the response would be, if it is about studying and looking into anything in earnest, I mean the hostilities, the combat situation on the ground, definitely it would be hard to be impartial because, you know, everyone's heart goes out. And we were always ready to participate, always. I have cited the most resonant cases to you right now. You can't fancy how much money Almaz and Tay spent on reconstructing, simulating and visualizing to get the evidence. Articles were written and books came out and films appeared. And what about Navalny? Where is the evidence? Where is lab tests? No one knows, but an Oscar was awarded, you know, awarding Oscars for political butchery. And, well, is pointless. In this case, it's pointless to talk to them. Without political machinations, we would be ready to talk. Yes, we will analyze, we'll comment in due course. Thank you. Thank you. Anadolu, a Turkish news outlet. We have two questions today. The first one is that the Russian officials on many occasions stated that their suspicions that the United States is behind Nord Stream blasts. Has the Russian side submitted a request for clarification to the United States? Repeatedly and publicly we said that, including to the American representatives. And our comment as of 21st of February contains the following quote. On the Russian side, it was emphasized that the United States is to provide clarification with respect to the explosion at Nord Stream 1 and 2 and not be in the way of an impartial investigation to find the culprits. So the short answer is yes. Thank you. And the other question, the New York Times newspaper came with an article, with a report citing past and current officials saying that the International Criminal Court will bring up convictions on 2 cases against Russia and will issue warrants of arrest against Russian representatives. You know, each day they have a lot of versions, very prolific people, and, you know, they don't provide a direct quote, rather some words ascribed to someone, former and current officials. You know, it is called manageable leaks. This is how the British media operate, and now the Americans follow suit, scaling it up. Previously, they have had the proper institutions of journalism, and now it is replaced by, you know, managed leaks. Someone said, who exactly? What department? Is it a former official or an incumbent one? Well, no one knows which department leaked that, because otherwise one could ask this department for clarification. This is done to keep this topic on the surface forever. They would not disclose their sources, you know their laws. Only several times they disclosed their sources. But for that, the entire system, the entire judiciary system should be shaken and put in turmoil. Second, if the ICC is concocting something for our country, that would not mean anything from the legal perspective, because we are no party to the Rome Statute of the ICC. We don't have any obligations, therefore, so with that institution would not cooperate. and any arrest warrants will be null and void legally for us from that entity. Thank you. Newsru, are you with us? Yes, hello. Newsru, you touched upon the Armenian Prime Minister's statement. I did not touch, I just finalized, concluded the discussion on that, because it's up to him, and just ask all clarifying questions, address all clarifying questions to the Armenian leadership or the press service of the Prime Minister of that country, but still want to ask a question, a clarifying question. You are Sevi. Well, in his statement he said that Moscow should be the guarantor of the Karabakh security. Otherwise, it should address the UN Security Council. If it cannot do that because of the objective reasons, can Russia turn to the UN Security Council in this case? Is it possible? I beg your pardon. I ain't heard that. Where should we turn in case the ally and the friend of Armenia cannot perform this guarantor function because of the objective reasons? He said, Mr. Pashinyan said, that Russia should turn to the UN Security Council so that the matter be resolved there. What is your take on that? Well, I could also say a whirlwind version. I would also only be able to say I will not try to analyze it, coming to an inference or a conclusion, and I will not mention any accords, any agreements. You know, this is something out of the ordinary, unexplainable, unaccountable. I'm not going to account for that, hence. This is unbelievable linguistic gymnastics. And second, it's tightrope walking. And the European Union is now coming up with a draft law that the non-for-profit and non-governmental entities in the EU would have to report any foreign sources. It would be good, you know, the media to turn to the European institutions, the European Commission, any spokesperson in Brussels who would either confirm or deny that, and definitely we were interested in that, and the article says that legislation will be put in place obliging all entities, including advisories, consultancies, and research structures receiving funding from abroad to disclose the sources of the funding, of that foreign funding. Imagining it will be the case is not difficult, because, you know, at the same time, strangely, they have set forth a counterclaim against Georgia. On the 7th of March, Mr. Borrell, commenting on the foreign agents law in Georgia, he said that I quote him as saying it is a very bad development for Georgia and its people, incompatible with the European values and standards. And in Borrell's intervention, read out from his name in the European Parliament, it was said that the European Union's initiative is a heartening development, and our stance is that such laws are kind of rudimentary because the world must be an open place and no one should interfere with others. But we saw two tendencies, two trends. The 1938 act applied by the US against Russian journalists.
Well, they used it also against journalists from Asia, but mainly against us. Also, we see that there is great interference in our domestic affairs, and we have to defend ourselves because under the guise of grants and aid and subsidies given for some lofty goals, what's happening in reality is some subversive work being done. When we put these two facts together, it seemed that we need to make a choice. Either we all have the right for this self-defense, the laws called to defend our domestic space, as this law is working in the US and they're using it actively, or everyone has to abandon this law. However, living in a paradigm where, like a British author wrote, well, not everyone is equal, and so someone can do everything and and the rest of them cannot. Well, either everyone is following this law, or everyone has to repeal it. That was our position, and I have voiced it multiple times before when I spoke on the law about foreign agents that we have elaborated and adopted, and we were under tremendous pressure because of it. And honestly, many were saying, well, this is not the best development, but we were explaining it, and we were saying that if it wasn't applied somewhere else, then we wouldn't have needed it. And unlike the US, where they have this law cemented from the 30s, from the 1930s, and it's rather repressive law. We had public discussion of the law, and some ministries gave their amendments and adjustments. They were considered, and so the law was changed, amended, and we can talk about its shortcomings as of today, but many things were indeed elaborated and improved. I can also say that there is nothing bad. Well, if collectively we do not abandon this practice, then I guess there is nothing bad about the fact that the citizens know what's the funding received by an organization, considering that the countries which are giving out these grants mainly do have such laws in place. Well, this is again about double standards and hypocrisy of the Brussels beacon of democracy. NGOs actively working on the Western approaches outside the EU, as per usual, just like a Caesar's wife, it's beyond reproach, without any control of the national authorities. And those who indeed are in favor of defending minorities and the minority opinions contrary to the political mainstream, they fall under strict Brussels control. And that would happen if indeed this law is adopted. They don't need a law to close down medias and to just erase such media. Well, the Western Europe, the older Europe, is more sensitive about it. Indeed, they have civil society, democracy, and display of democracy. That very democracy that was founded in the 17th, 18th, and the 19th century. So they simply cannot disregard everything. They still need some kind of legal justification for it. There is greater trend toward the neo-colonial Burrell's concept, who divided the world into the jungle and a beautiful garden. So the logic is rather primitive. Everything that's done in the EU and in the West is good by definition, and what's happening outside of the West is good only if the US allows it, and the Brussels will do it if it benefits it. But, well, I was simply commenting on the article, but I think Brussels will need to explain itself. Do they have this draft? Are they going to adopt it? Well, if it is indeed confirmed, then I guess it's a tremendous shame for all of the EU institutions. saying one thing for the outside audience, telling someone to withdraw the laws, but doing this domestically, simultaneously, and lying to their own population, this is simply unacceptable. Moving on. Do we have Tverskaya 13 with us? Hello. Hello. Russia has supported the extension of the grain deal for 60 days, and Turkey, in its turn, has brought back the Russian goods transit. Can you comment on the situation? Did indeed the Turkish side wait for the solution of the grain deal in order to bring back the transit? Well, I have already commented on the grain deal multiple times. I don't think I have anything to add. Indeed, we intend to implement it, but it has to go two ways. As for Turkey, I think, as for the, could you please repeat the question about the Turkey? The fact that the Turkey has deblocked the transit, well, we intend to build our mutually beneficial trade cooperation with Turkey, and dedicated Russian and Turkish authorities are in close touch about solving practical issues, including the one that you have mentioned. Thank you. The next question. On the 14th of March, the capital has hosted a Congress, the International Movement of Russophiles, with the participation of Minister Lavrov. What will be the support of the ministry? What will be the cooperation? I don't know if you paid attention to it. We have highlighted it many times. This movement was not created upon the initiative of Russian state authorities or even public organizations. This is something that was spontaneously happened among those people who know Russian culture and love it and want to support it, when indeed it is in jeopardy of being cancelled, well, at least in theory. This initiative has been discussed multiple times throughout some time, actually. I've heard some discussions and debates from abroad. We've received letters, and now this happened. It was a combination of efforts of different people from different countries. Later, it was supported by the Russian public organizations and institutions. And when the decision was made to hold this first Congress, to institutionalize this movement about delegates, then we were asked to help as honorary guests, to receive an invitation to send representatives from different branches of authority that have to do with the international policy, with culture, will standing up for truly humanitarian principles around the world. And that was done. You have seen how widely Russia was represented and Russian authorities. The way it will go down later, well, I think it's a question for the organizers. I've heard from them. There were several events where I took part in by their invitation. I think they want to expand and to create a network. Well, maybe not missions or representations, but maybe delegates to different countries, because there is tremendous potential. They want to actively develop across many topics, but I think you better apply to them. We'll respond and help them in any way possible, within what is possible within law, and that will bear fruit. Constructive fruit. Thank you. Moving on. Do we have Radio Saga? Yes, hello, hello. I wanted to learn about the U.S. drone and the legal aspects that the U.S. is referencing when they summoned the Russian ambassador to Washington. Well, they think that they're right, of course, but they're saying that Russia has violated rules and the law. So what's the reference there by the U.S. authorities? You know, I cannot really talk about it. I don't know about any legal aspects in regard to international law or their grievances or anything. I haven't heard about it. What I've seen that some American experts have voiced contemplations, well, experts and contemplations, I'd like to highlight, that the Russian party has violated the U.S.-Soviet Incidents at Sea Agreement of 1972. Actually, it is still effective. I think we have to proceed from the following. As the preamble of the treaty says, and you can read it, the parties have concluded this agreement pursuing the goal to ensure the safety of navigation of their navies in open seas and the flights of their military aircraft in the airspace above it, according to the terms and definitions in Article 1 of the treaty. The term aircraft, for the purposes of the agreement, and now I quote, all military manned, heavier than air and lighter than air craft, excluding spacecraft. And this clause says that the 1972 agreement is not applicable to drones and all other unmanned aerial vehicles of the parties. So once again, this quote, the key is manned aircraft, and that was a drone, so experts does not work here. Do we have Ambassadorial Life with us? Yes. Yes, hello. I have one question. The success of Russian foreign policy and stability of international relations in the coming years will depend on whether we'll be able to organize a friendly, wide interregional coalition with priority partners participating. Distancing away from the West creates conditions for cooperation with other civilizational platforms, Chinese, Arab and Muslim, Indian and South Pacific, African, Latin American, and ASEAN. So the question is there a greater relevance of Russia as a unique country and civilization capable of providing global balance? Well, your question is basically for a conference, over a 2-week-long conference. And in a nutshell, what you're saying about relevance of Russian role in geopolicy, that has been tested by 2022. Considering the pressure that was applied by the West on all countries, well, they could have largely abandoned that, or just saying that Russia, well, is not necessary in global affairs. They could have said it, and they had the reason to do it. Well, an argument to it. Maybe it's not, would be not an honest and sincere reason, but it would do. Simply using the momentum to abandon what's unnecessary. Maybe save face sometimes, explaining that we were unnecessary, irrelevant for many years, but being friendly, they did not tell us that. And now that they're under pressure and true values are at stake for them, economy, finance, stability, security, and so on, sovereignty, now they can say to our face, well, what happened was actually the contrary. Contrary to tremendous pressure by the West, the positions were strengthened of the whole regions of the world, the desire to build their own policy, choosing their own partners, and whom to delegate the solution of global issues to. Or they took the neutral position so that the conflicting parties would have a chance to solve their matters themselves, or playing a mediator role or a peacekeeper role. And in any case, these countries have reconfirmed once again that they have understanding for the situation that's happening as a Western provocation that have led to an open phase of the conflict. Moreover, they're also respecting our country, and they understand that without the Russian presence in the world would have plunged into the abyss of global conflicts and issues long ago. That has been reconfirmed by 2022, not by the fat years, but by the lean years when everyone was supposed to be just for themselves. And I think we've stood up to that test. When I say we, I mean the role of Russia in global affairs. Well, that's just in a nutshell, if I respond. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Moving on. Do we have overworldnews.com? Yes. Madam Zakharova, please comment on the words of the main human rights defender of the UN, Mr. Turk, who at the Human Rights Council spoke about the decreasing space for civil community in Russia because Novaya Gazeta was closed down, and there are criminal cases due to calumny against armed forces, foreign agents law, expansion of legislation prohibiting propaganda of non-traditional relations. What do you think? What would facilitate the change of this rhetoric? Well, I will not argue with him. If under the civil society he understood those who conduct the Western ideas, foreign and destructive for our country, not critical ideas, but destructive. Criticism can be constructive. It can be aimed at improving the situation, at saving something, but these destructive projects, ideas, and concepts, if that is meant under civil society, then indeed I guess, well, that happened. But I guess they left. But if we talk about civil society and public actors who are active in solving internal issues, not for the money and not by the order from outside, but due to patriotic feelings, mercy and compassion for the neighbor, that is all right. We're coping. Well, if you mean just one segment of the community, then it means that it's disrespecting the rest. Without noting regional press, our central media, I guess he should have traveled and taken a look at what the number of media that we have and the way they are developing. Naturally, indeed, we have media giants, conglomerates of the media world, and with a broad TV channels, network, digital platforms, and so on. When we have a tremendous number of regional media, and a lot of them are not even allowed to go to the West as participants of the conference. Now, to the question about what you've said, what you have referenced and quoted, closing down of certain media. Did they want to quote themselves when they were telling the Crimean mass media, the most relevant in the majority of discussions on Crimean matters, the way they told that they were unwilling and incapable to issue them a visa to travel to an international organization, the way they were erased from the agenda, how tremendous number of journalists and media actors were put on the sanctions list, how civil society was prevented from broadcasting their materials and TV channels and internet channels. Well, if that was not mentioned, then it's not objective. And if it's not objective, there is nothing to discuss, just as maybe as an example of inobjectivity, non-objectivity. Do we have Vmesty magazine, Compatriots magazine? Yes, Valery Lebedev, good evening. Many citizens of the EU, and I cannot name names and the countries because they will be persecuted. There are questions about the upcoming Victory Day. Will there be an immortal regiment? How can you prepare for that? in advance? How can you acquire St. George's ribbons? And is Russia afraid that if such ribbons are distributed in the countries, Russia will be accused of interference in domestic affairs? I'd like to say that the general sentiment is very vibrant, optimistic, and happy. I guess people have been reconfirmed in their idea that they need to join efforts not for themselves alone, but for the ideas that make life, well, what you call worth of it, civilization and culture, because civilization is not just technical breakthroughs and convenience, but civilization is preserving the best historical experience, the development for the humanity. And that is moral and ethnic values and traditions. I'd like to mention that Russophiles, using their banners, are gathering, well, from what I've heard, I heard it when agenda was discussed, and naturally the idea of defending what you've mentioned about organizations, about defending the Victory Day and maintaining the memory about those times,
etc. So I think a lot will become part of the civic initiative and undertaking. Now a bit of statistics. In 2023, the Russian compatriots in more than 120 countries already started preparing the commemorative events to mark the 78th anniversary of the victory in the Great Patriotic War. They are faced with repressions, but they are determined and firm to preserve the historical truth and preclude falsifications and warping the truth. The Immortal Regiment definitely helps unite the diaspora, and as a token of remembrance of those who sacrificed their lives fighting against Nazism, it can be online and offline, either way. There's a lot of creativity. The St. George's ribbon, the Garden of Remembrance and the Candle of Remembrance and the Floral Ordnance, also bicycle runs and photo exhibitions, and will be planned, will be implemented and held. Foreign Minister will supply insignia and the St. George's ribbon to them. If we talk about unfriendly countries, we will find a way to distribute the items there, though they're banned in those countries, but actually are a token of triumph of the human spirit over madness and ferocious practices. We see that the authorities of some countries put handicap on those who want to revere the memory of the heroes of the Great Patriotic War in the Baltic states and in Moldova last year. They illegally banned all commemorative events on the occasion of the 9th of May, despite the fact that the 9th of May is enshrined in a UN General Assembly resolution. I'm not speaking about domestic holidays in those countries. It's up to them, but the UN General Assembly prescribed to enshrine this day, and the St. George's ribbon exposure is banned, and we call on the foreign authorities to be constructive and reasonable in the light of the forthcoming events. It's not about interfering with their affairs. We reject that altogether. It is solely about allowing all those wishing to do so to revere the memory of the winners over the Nazis, and today their governments are irresponsibly destructing their relations with our country. If that is all, I would, with your permission, Madam Zakharova, just a tiny question. I'll be brief. AUKUS has been the talk of today's briefing.
to a large extent. But one more question: any coordinated steps together with China if further activities of the AUKUS will roil and upend international security and the regional security in the APR? Together with our Chinese friends, we have been discussing that matter. I can ask for specification of concrete steps and measures. We would coordinate our response on international platforms and the public response of ours. Both our countries are concerned about that because of the non-proliferation issues. I will definitely look it up and submit it to you. Thank you. I thank everyone. Unless there are more questions, I would tell you all goodbye, all the best.